This edition of Mac Voices is brought to you by MacPaw, the makers of CleanMyMac X. Your Mac as good as new. Find out more at macpaw.com/podcast. Welcome to Mac Voices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, this is the second part of our discussion with author Glenn Fleishman about his latest Take Control book, Take Control of Zoom. In the first part, Glenn gave us some Zoom tips, some advanced, some not so advanced. And we also discussed Zoom's response to some of the security issues they've had and how they've done in that regard. This time around, we get into more tips and discussions of features and why Zoom is so approachable, recording, and a whole lot more. So with that, we'll get back to our discussion with Glenn. Yeah, and I think they've gotten treated just a little bit unfairly in the press in some places. I mean, what they did last year with the piece of software they installed on your computer that left a door open, the way they reacted to that was probably textbook, the wrong way to react to it.
Exactly, yeah.
But when all this, once they got that fixed and now these other things have happened, now they've become a textbook for how you do respond when you receive some of these criticisms.
Well, you saw when a researcher on Twitter discovered that there was some bypass that Zoom was doing in the installer, and he tweeted about it, and the CEO responded to him and said, "You're right. We're going to look into that. We're going to get it fixed." And 2 days later, the new installer was out. And it wasn't so much a security hole. It was a potential one. Like it was a potential for somebody to distribute a Zoom installer that had a malicious component that might bypass, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't at the same scale as that like web server they installed without us knowing that reinstalled Zoom, which was, again, for efficiency. They weren't trying to spy on us. They weren't thinking about all the security implications. So that I thought was very good. I also say the company's gotten a lot of criticism because of their involvement in China, and some of it's valid. Like, we should be concerned about software development that happens in China. It needs to be more heavily scrutinized because of the government's required and legal in China ability to affect what happens inside the country. So, but I think there's been a lot of unfortunate, it's racism or something like it, where people say, well, it was founded by this guy who is Chinese. And so obviously he works for the Chinese military and he's a sleeper cell or whatever. He came to this country in the 90s. He worked for Cisco for many years. He founded Zoom. He's, the company's operations are in America and they provide service worldwide. And I think it's a big stretch to accuse the firm of being in cahoots with China or allowing China to intercept American traffic. There's no evidence for it. And I think they made a mistake about routing traffic because of all the load they went through. They explained what happened. They made changes, and there's actually a way people can, in fact, monitor what's going on today. So that group, Citizen Lab, put out a report that I think was completely accurate and valid, warning that Zoom hadn't disclosed all its Chinese connections and how data was being routed. And the company said more or less, yeah, you're right. We got to work on that, and we're going to fix this thing because that was a technical error. And I want to see more disclosure about how they vet and audit software code that's written by contractors in China, because that is an ongoing national security and corporate security issue. But I think you can evaluate that in context of other companies. Many companies have programming operations in China, not just Zoom.
Right. And Zoom, the load they've been under, I mean, because when the COVID-19 situation happened and everybody moved home, it became the default for, well, this is how we're going to solve the problem. And that means, my company, your company, every school, that's an exaggeration, but, a lot of schools, a lot of colleges. I mean, the load that they got dumped on them was amazing. And the amount of downtime that they have not had is frankly, amazing too.
I think that's why a lot of security people who have read, like, Steve Bellovin, who's an old Bell Labs guy, has been kicking around for decades and teaches Columbia. I mean, he's written critically in the sense of analyzing what the security flaws are, but very complimentarily, I don't know if I'm saying that word. He's very complimentary, let's say, about how Zoom has managed this unfeasible load. And that's what I see consistently is people who are internet and security experts say, they have challenges that they need to meet and overcome, but holy cow, they kept the internet together. Like my kids, there's one guy at a security firm where he said, even while I'm evaluating Zoom as whether it's safe for my clients, I also see my 3 children being educated over Zoom every day, and my whole family it would be untenable for us. And it's not like Teams and Hangouts and Google Meet and Cisco WebEx, BlueJeans, Jitsi. Like there's a zillion tool, a GoToMeeting. I mean, we could spend half an hour listing every product that allows for collaboration or webinar presentation or all these things. But it's that Zoom had that very good, generous free tier. And so the easiest thing you could do was you click, and it works in a web browser using what's it called, WebRTC, I think. And so they you can use a client, and you need one on mobile. But if you're on the desktop, you don't have to install anything. You can click and use it in the browser if the host's account is set up correctly. And I think the lack of friction, the lack of money involved was amazing. And then you saw Skype had a way to let people join from a browser without having a Microsoft Live account. They never promoted it. And then suddenly they added the Meet Now button in Skype. Just click it, creates a link you can share. A huge improvement for Skype for doing ad hoc meetings without people with an account or a Skype client. Google extended Google Meet, their corporate product. You used to have to pay for it. You'd have to have a paid G Suite license. They extended it to just a few weeks ago. It started in, I think, early May. Anyone with a Google account can use Google Meet for free for base level. They're giving businesses a free G Suite account with more sophisticated capabilities. WebEx expanded its free tier as well, even though it's more business oriented. So everyone kind of followed on, I think, out of a combination of generosity and support. I think that's a real thing. I don't think these companies are doing it just for marketing, but there's a good marketing aspect too. They want companies and schools to see that their tools work as well. So my kids' schools, they already had a Microsoft license for the entire district. They went to Teams. Teams was seen as more secure. And of course, one of the first classes that happened at one of my kids' middle school was team bombed. It wasn't Zoom bombed because they were using Teams, and somebody came in and there was all this crap going on. The teacher had to shut it down and learn some of the privacy controls. It's just that was much less likely with Teams because Teams is a little more of a closed system, and Zoom was not. But I think Zoom won in the marketplace because it was sort of click, click, and go. Everything else seemed to, even if it didn't require an account, it seemed like you needed a Google account or a Microsoft Live account or a Cisco account. And even when you didn't, it still was another hurdle to overcome. And I think that's kind of why they won. They won the battle for free.
I agree with everything you said, but I also think that there is something to be said for the Zoom interface, because the Zoom interface is clean, it's simple, it presents you with the controls that you need. And it's sort of, you click something like, let's say chat. You click chat and a chat box pops out, but you don't have to have it open. And you click the participants and a participants box open. And then if you do screen sharing, well, then you're going just a little deeper. So I think it's a study in interface design about, let's not put everything a la some companies we can both name, where there are 50 options at the top menu bar. They're what are there on 7 or 8, and maybe it's 10, and it doesn't even feel like it because they're spaced out all over the screen, so you don't feel like, oh my God, I'm stressing out. What are these 25 buttons? It's so easy that I think that's another thing that made it approachable, made people not afraid to play with the virtual backgrounds like we were talking about.
I'll tell you the other thing too is I think the grid view in Zoom is one of its big selling features, and it's not available. I'm trying to think. We for TidBITS we went and did group conferences in FaceTime, Zoom. What else we use? Skype and not WebEx. We did one other, and Google Hangouts, not because Meet hadn't been opened up yet when we tried it. It was still a business product, and the ability to have a grid of faces. So for 3 people or 4 people, all the tools are sort of similar. You can see, and FaceTime has that terrible sort of, it only shows 4 people large, and other people small, and then whoever's talking, their head gets bigger. iOS 13.5, you will be able to disable that. So the heads will all stay the same size if you want it, but you have to turn off the enlargement feature. But nothing really has that simplicity. And I think it requires a lot of technical engineering. And it only works on the desktop. Like on the iPad, you can get 9 people in grid view. On mobile devices, it's still no more than 4. But on a desktop machine, you can have, with the app, you can have 25 to 49, depending on how many processing cores you have, and you need like an i7 if you want 50 or 49 people to show up at once. But I get 25 on my iMac, and as I say, in a meeting of 90 people I was in this morning, I had to page through a few screens, but it tends to optimize for recent speakers. So you see the people who most recently spoke, you see their faces on the first screen. But I think especially like you're doing a social thing and you've got 10 other people or 5 other people, you want to see everybody at once. You don't want to be kind of going back and forth. And I mean, I think there's a place for this sort of active speaker approach, which Zoom offers as well, where the person who is the primary speaker is appearing solely or foremost. And it works best, I think, in a business environment or meeting environment, a school environment. But for this, I think for school where someone's instructing, but I think any kind of discussion where everyone is an equal participant, and for school classroom discussions and for social settings, I think that grid view is just so appealing to get everyone's face. It's a lot of cognitive load because you're looking, we're monkeys. We're not made to look at 15 faces, 30 faces at once. Like, it's a little bit of overload, but it also is really effective. Like, I wouldn't want to do that for 5 or 10 hours a day. And I know some people have to, but I don't mind doing it for an hour or two and seeing everybody at once.
But you bring up a good point that not only do you have that grid view, but you also have the speaker view that you can control, and it doesn't demand that, okay, this is the way everybody else is going to look at it.
Right.
Everybody can choose. And then
that's amazing, right?
Yeah. And then with the pin feature, there's even a little more control. And so again, that's what I like, is just there are layers of control. It can be really deep if you want it to be, or if you feel the need to try to find a way to control something. But the basic functions of the thing are easy and accessible.
This reminds me, though, I think there was one thing I don't know that you asked earlier, but I wanted to bring up. I mentioned Zoom bombing in passing. And I know that a lot of people ask me, they're like, is Zoom safe? But they don't think about the security side. They mean the like invasive person side. And I think it's worth just calling out because Zoom's made a bunch of security changes. So all meetings have to have password, as I said, like as of May, I think it was May 9th. All meetings, if you have a free account or the one host account or a free education account that was upgraded, passwords are mandatory. And that takes kind of the bar down because there were ways people would find meeting IDs and join, or for a while, there was a bug or a flaw where people could try random meeting IDs in really large numbers and then join ones without passwords. So Zoom has turned all those dials down. And in the book, the thing is, it's very hard as an individual participant in Zoom, I want to say, to remain safe, in the sense that you don't have a lot of tools as a participant. I tell people to not engage in chat. Like, if you're in a meeting with strangers and someone direct messages you within Zoom, I would ignore it, basically, or I'd report it to the host if it was inappropriate. But that's almost the only control you have. Or, you could choose to not stream your video, but that's not abuse from someone else. That's you making a choice about whether you're seen or not. But in meetings that involve, I say strangers, like people who don't normally work together, know each other, or like there's been these alcoholics, Al-Anon and AA and NA, all these meetings of people who, there's hundreds of thousands of meetings a day just in the United States of people who need this kind of in-person support. Those move to Zoom because, again, it's free, multi-platform, cheap, and you can join anonymously. You don't have to have an account, so you can join and put in, I'm Glenn F. I don't have to say I'm Glenn Fleishman or have an email address attached. Anyway, the thing is, all these groups were nervous about it, and I think, and rightly so, because people were trolling and disrupting and spreading information. That has gotten a lot better. I'm not hearing almost anything about it anymore. And in the book, because it's hard as a participant to do much, I have a large section for hosts, people starting meetings. Like, how do you configure your account? Because Zoom has this funny thing. I'm sure you've noticed there are account preferences that affect what happens in a meeting. And some of those account preferences are things you can change during a meeting, and some are not. So some things you have to go back to the website, log into your account, go to account preferences and settings and make changes, and then they affect meetings. And others, the meeting is going on, you're like, well, I don't want anyone to screen share, so I'm going to turn off that ability. So I break that down, like, what can you do before you get set up? Like, you're doing public meetings, maybe it's governmental, maybe it's a school PTSA meeting, maybe it's a support group, or it's a social club, and it's all these members, not all of whom know each other, but they're all members. It's in different chapters of a national group, and you want to provide as much security. It's like, here's how to set up your account, and then in the meeting, here's all the things you can do in the meeting. Here's how you don't admit people into the meeting. Use the waiting room so you can see when jerks are trying to join. Here's how you can stop people's video during a meeting. Here's how you boot people. And then Zoom just recently added a report user feature, so you can report somebody as a host for any kind of harassing or unwanted behavior, and then Zoom can block their account if they had one, but they can also take other measures to try to identify how that person connects and keep them from getting into the Zoom system in the future anywhere in the world, or for any meeting anywhere.
And once again, it's Zoom reacting to situations instead of putting their head in the sand or just apologizing. They apologize and then they take action, and it's action that it happens soon enough that you haven't forgotten about it.
That's right.
They appear really responsive.
Yeah, out of nowhere, they just put the security button in the desktop client like it hadn't existed. And suddenly they said, we're adding a button because it's going to centralize everything. And so overnight, it was like, oh, these settings that are in 10 different places, I click it, and now it's just at my fingertips. One thing they added then, I will tell us, is a great tip for people hosting meetings, is lock meeting. You click on that. I recommend people host meetings only from the desktop app, either Windows or Linux or Mac. You don't host from a mobile client. It's much harder. You can do it, and you can host from the website or from a web app too. Chrome is the best choice for that. But the desktop apps have all the features. So you use a waiting room, which means when people join, so they have to have a password to join. They can only join after you join the meeting. So you start the meeting. They're added to a waiting room. You have to admit them. You can do it all at once or one by one. Then, when everyone you expect is there, you lock the meeting and no one else can get in. No one else can even come into the waiting room. Then you don't have to worry about someone Zoom bombing. And if somebody is supposed to come in and they've forgotten or they're late, you give them an out of band method. You say, text me, email me, call me, Skype me, whatever, tell me, and then you can unlock the meeting briefly. They come in, lock it again. And then even if it's a public session, you're doing an AA meeting, you say, look, for safety, we're not letting anybody in after 5 minutes after the meeting starts. And so I'm sorry, but we have to do that for safety. You lock the meeting, and then the trolls who are looking for public meetings to disrupt, they often don't find out about them until they start. People post the URL at the last minute with a password or other information. You prevent those people from being able to grief you, and your meeting goes on as you hoped.
This edition of MacVoices is supported by MacPaw, the makers of CleanMyMac X. If you've been around the Mac for any length of time, there are software titles and publishers that you learn to know and trust. And if you haven't been around the Mac for very long, it's time you start that process. MacPaw has been part of the Mac scene for more than 10 years, as has its flagship utility, CleanMyMac X. That alone says something about both the company and the product. But let me tell you a little more. CleanMyMac X is the utility you want when you want to optimize your Mac for peak performance. Using the Smart Scan, you can delete system log files and caches that are no longer needed. You would be surprised at how many old, abandoned files might be clogging up your Mac. CleanMyMac X even has a malware check built in to help protect you from any software that the bad guys might have installed on your Mac. And best of all, you can download a trial version of CleanMyMac X to check out all the features for yourself. And that's what I want you to do right now. Visit macpaw.com/podcast and download your copy of CleanMyMac X today. That's macpaw.com/podcast, macpaw.com/podcast, to get your trial version of CleanMyMac X. Run the Smart Scan and see what CleanMyMac X can help you get rid of. CleanMyMac X at macpaw.com/podcast. Take it for a spin. Thanks to MacPaw for their support of MacVoices. I was so glad to hear that you were writing this. I was using Zoom before COVID-19 and for quite a while to record, and we won't get into all the whys and wherefores. But I found the website useful, but I didn't feel like there was a good, okay, this is where you start, and then this is where you go next and next. I had to experiment a little, and I'd find out about a feature, and that's, look, I'd much rather have them working on the background of the technical stuff. But having this book, I think it's one of those books I want to recommend to anybody that is hosting meetings or is using Zoom for business, because it's like a little manual for Zoom. And somebody's going to say, well, Zoom doesn't need a manual. Well, maybe not. until you want to do some of the advanced features. And
Oh my
then,
God, or just control a meeting. You're trying to run a meeting. I'm always looking something up. I mean, I wrote the book partly for myself because I can't figure out where some things are, how they worked.
yeah, yeah. And again, once you find out, it's like so many things. Once you find out,
Yeah.
it makes perfect sense as to why they would put it there. But until I know it, it's there. It's not evident.
I think the documentation at Zoom is kind of middling. Like as somebody who's a technology, like a book writer in technology, and have done technical writing also in some documentation, I'd say it's not bad, but it feels like an early draft. I mean, Logitech and some other sites out there, they have the same thing. You go there and you're like, did you never finish this? It feels like it's kind of the outline for what your documentation should be. Then you go to a site that does it really well and you say, oh, these people know, like I don't need to write a book about this product because they wrote the book. So like, for instance, Zoom has 1 million views, and in every view, there are options of how you control them. And if you're in full screen, it's different than if you're in normal screen. They have, an option to full screen, maximize, or fit in window, and they interact in this ridiculous way. So I go to their documentation, and all the photos are of this one poor person who's probably, the one person in their documentation or marketing department, many different views of, I think her name is Sarah or something like this. She's linked to the system from multiple cameras at once, or it's a couple other people. They're clearly all in one Zoom office. It's all the same people. And even the backgrounds are all you can see other people in each other's backgrounds. There's nothing wrong with that. And I commend them for providing visual documentation to go along with the written stuff. But there are so many things I couldn't find an answer to. I had a test, and sometimes I'd have to, find like 4 other people and say, can you get on a call with me? Because I can't figure this out. We'd all be clicking stuff like, oh, there it is. And sure enough, I go back to the Zoom documentation. It's not mentioned there. And I think this is a function of having a very dedicated IT supported business focus. So most of the people using Zoom were either in education operations or businesses where there is an IT department. And those of us using it more casually, not for business, maybe we discovered it through business or whatever, we either were technical or we just muddled along, right? And now when you have, 300 million participants or 300 million people per, what is it? They describe this particularly. There are meetings that contain 300 million participants per day on average. So it's not necessarily 300 million different people, but it's meetings that comprise a total of that many participants, some who might have been in multiple meetings that day. Anyway, it's a ton of people, and their documentation has not caught up. However, I assume they're making like an extra $1 billion a month right now. I mean, I'm kidding, because a lot of the service is free, but they have all these paid tiers, and I assume they have a lot of people who've gone to paid tiers. I assume the revenue is way up. We'll find out when they present their quarterlies. And they could drop a couple $1 million on getting world-class documentation. And I hope they do. Like, I don't want my book to disappear as having a purpose, because, our books are more narrative. They're written more task-focused. They're not like I don't explain every single feature in a product. But I would love it if they would dump some money on their documentation approach and make some of the basic stuff easier for people. And I think they have not needed to do it as much before now, and now they have the means and opportunity to do such.
Yeah, right after they get a little sleep.
Oh my God, they must all be working 18-hour days, 7 days a week.
And I want to also, before we get out of here, there are 2 things I want to touch on. First of all, I want to mention the recording features, because this is no small thing, and it's another place where I think they jumped ahead of the competition in a big way.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of this because, in fact, before the pandemic, Jason Snell, who's former editor-in-chief of Macworld, runs, I'm going to plug him, sixcolors.com, a great site about Mac reporting, and also is the head honcho at our fun, incomparable network of geeky podcasts, which is a bunch of us who just do talk about culture and stuff like that. It's fun. I'm hosting a show now called Pants in the Boot. I bring in US, UK, sometimes Canadian, Australian panelists, and we talk about what words mean in different countries and what we call things. It's kind of a hoot. So we do podcasts like that. Anyway, so Jason is also often managing, it's like 50 podcasts in the network that record at various intervals. He was often managing people across continents and time zones. He's standardized on Zoom instead of Skype, because Zoom was the superior tool for having a lot of people, even if you didn't all want to see each other, the audio synchronization and the audio recording was so good. So if you do podcasting or you do any kind of multi-person meeting with audio where you need to produce good audio at the end, especially if you need to edit separate tracks, Zoom's free tier lets you record not only record a plain audio track, but have every speaker's audio recorded separately into a separate file that you can edit. As you know, Chuck, I know you're nodding along. It's a great feature for podcasting, but also if you're doing any kind of event where you need to produce better audio at the end, you want to produce not necessarily a podcast, but an audio version of it or something, and people are remote like they are now. It's a wonderful tool. But then the video recording is fantastic as well. It's very high quality. You can do it. Anybody can be allowed in a meeting. The host has to allow it, can record locally, and it records exactly what you see. If you pop up to the $20 a month tier or any of the higher tiers, you can use Zoom's cloud recording, which I think at $20 a month, you can store up to about 5 hours, 4 or 5 hours. And in that mode, you can actually choose to have it record multiple different video views at the same time, and then edit that together later into a multi-view thing, as well as having the audio. Or you can give participants access to it, so after a meeting, they can just go to the Zoom site and stream or download and play it. So it's I would say, on top of a really great video experience they offer, they have this extra thing that I'm not sure everyone knows about, and especially with people doing all these conferences, or business meetings and classes and conferences and so forth online, the ability to record within and save locally. So you don't even have to pay for this. This isn't the free tier. The free tier, they let you record your meetings to your own, a desktop computer. I think that's an amazing bonus on top of free.
I want to keep going because there's so many other things, because I've become a huge fan of Zoom. And even though we're not using it right now, they're doing so much right. But before we get out of here, I want to make sure that I do ask about, we're both Mac guys and Apple guys, but do you address all the other platforms that Zoom covers?
Yeah, I try to cover, I've tested things across platforms, and Zoom kind of has their own platform development tool. It's pretty clearly, they have some kind of cross-platform porting tool. So it's shocking how similar most features are across the mobile versions and the desktop and the web version. In some cases, and throughout the book, I will break out something if it's only available in iOS versus Android. One of the interesting ones is that the desktop version of Zoom for Mac OS can let you screen share from a iOS or iPad OS device plugged in over USB or via AirPlay. That similar capability doesn't exist yet with Android and Windows. So if you have a Mac OS iOS setup, you're actually in a slightly better shape. So if you want to use your camera or your phone as a camera, or have it on a tripod or something and use it as, Zoom lets you bring in like a document scanner too. So a document viewer like they use in classrooms, you can have that as a second USB device and switch to it, which is great for classes. I know people apparently, a lot of teachers do that all the time. They're talking and then they click and they go over to the piece of paper they stuck under the document viewer. But you could also say like, I'm actually going to do an online workshop over Zoom with the School of Visual Concepts about laser cutting and letterpress printing. It's a great topic. And they can't do in-person classes, so we're repeating a workshop we did a couple of years ago. I've got a laser cutter directly over to the left of me right now, and I'm going to set up maybe an iPad, maybe my iPhone, so that it's above the laser cutter, because I want to do a demo during the class, and we'll be doing Zoom, and I'll be able to hit a button and switch over to it and get the feed from that, and that's really cool. So that's a little extra. Most features, though, are nearly identical across all platforms. And the big difference is desktop apps do have more power than the web apps. Safari is the worst app to use with Zoom if you're using the web app and not installing a native desktop client. So if you feel like you don't want to install the Zoom software, and some people don't, just use Google Chrome, which is a very secure browser to begin with. Install that, and then you get nearly every desktop app feature is available inside of Google Chrome. You can't, for instance, you can't share or listen to computer audio in Safari. Like there's some kind of, I don't know what the issue is, why Zoom hasn't done it. There's apparently some technical issue for how they've implemented their side of things, but in Chrome it works fine, for instance. So I call all that out in the book. If you're trying to figure out what to use, and Zoom has a good capabilities page you can go to and like see every capability, every feature by which browser and version and platform. So that's great too. That's one of the places they've done best is with system requirements and features and what works on different platforms, what amount of bandwidth you need to do certain kinds of conferencing. All those things are great on its site.
Yeah, and again, you were talking that's something I did not know about their development tool, and that sort of explains why the experience is so consistent across platforms, and that's another place where it shines. It just makes it so much easier and so nice to work with this thing, even if I jump from my iPad to my phone to my desktop. It's so similar that I don't feel like I have to learn something new all over again.
Well, what's funny too is it's, the Mac app and the iOS app are not very, iOS or Mac like, but they're consistent with each other and they're consistent with the Windows and Android version. So at some level, that's better if you're working with people across a lot of platforms. You can say, click this button and the button's there everywhere they look. It's always available. And it's like, hooray, right? And also to their technical documentation credit, every feature that requires you to do something in an app, they have a thing at the bottom that's like Windows, Mac OS, Linux, which they support actually fairly well on the desktop, and then Android and iOS. And they even if it's the same, they'll just say here's what it's like on Windows and Mac OS. But they have these clickable windows, so they'll say like here's how you do a thing, and that's very nice. Like I don't go into that. That's the kind of detail you want in documentation. You don't need in a book that's trying to help you understand the overall or specific tasks. But I really appreciate that they did that. So I know I was criticizing their documentation for being thin at one level, but they're very thick on the multi-platform specific things to click or tap.
I think it's fair to say we're both fans of Zoom. I've really, it's still my favorite platform for the multi-person kind of thing. And this book will just not only get you up and running with it if you haven't, but also let you tap some of the power that's there and make you a better host and probably make you a better participant as well.
Well, that was my goal. So I appreciate hearing that. I think there's a lot of power under the hood that's hard to necessarily figure out where you get to. And I was hoping to kind of untangle that for people.
Yeah. I mean, you and take control, that's sort of the modus operandi that you all operate under. So thank you.
I'll tell you one other thing is take control of working from home temporarily. The free book we released a couple months ago when the pandemic started. Joe and I have just done an updated version of that. It's going to be free forever, and updated it with a little bit of it's partly to say, hey, there's a Zoom book too, because we want to tell people if you want more, if you're using that tool, it's great. But also, I kind of refocused it a little bit, so it's, hey, you're working at home now. Like, here's what you might want to change or think about now that you're thinking about you might be home for 3 months or 6 months, or there one insurance company, Northwest Insurance, they're not National Insurance, said they have like 40,000 workers who they said will be permanently working from home now because they decided it doesn't make sense to have 5 of their offices, and all those people who didn't necessarily expect it, and some of them may love it, maybe not at the moment because everyone's home, are working from home. So I refocused the book a little bit to be more about our current reality and to put in some information about buying air conditioning because you deserve it.
Yeah, thank you. I did not know about that update, so that's great. That's great.
That's out just this week as well.
So, folks, of course, TakeControlBooks.com is where you go to get Glenn's book, and along with the Working from Home book and everything else that the Take Control authors do, and each and every one of them are worth your time. Believe me. Glenn, thank you. It's been a whole lot of fun. Before you leave, I want to make sure we let folks know where they can find you when you're not authoring Take Control books.
Well, if they must, and I warn them, no, I'm not that unapproachable or difficult. But you can find me on Twitter at GLENNF, GLENN, F like Frank, and my website is GlennF, GLENNF.com. It's been interesting because I was in the middle of this tiny type museum project I've talked about in previous episodes, and we had to put a halt to it because there's some manufacturing components. There's a piece that we need to make, and the good news is that with the improvements in Washington State, it should be possible soon for the woodworker I've been working with. Everything else is done except this one complicated piece. So sometime in the near future, she should be able to finish that, and I can actually finish sending out about 80 tiny type museums to people who bought them between February of last year and late last year, and then make another batch after that. Anyway, but it's been like I totally support the shutdowns. I'm totally happy that everyone is safe and whatever, but it's exciting to know that they may have safety precautions in place where a little bit of opening can happen and we can start getting these museums out.
Yeah, but you make a good point that, as this crisis, the situation, I should say, is going to change. how people work and where they work for a long time to come, if not permanently. And so, folks, it's another reason to get your training in now, so you're comfortable with it, so you can do it.
So the next job you get, if you lose your job or your job transitions or you want to get a new job, the next job you have will probably use Zoom or something like it, but probably Zoom.
Yeah. Glenn, thank you so much. We will talk again soon when the next book, or maybe just, to play catch up on a bunch of other things.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chuck. Thanks for having me on.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is MacVoices. Once again, TakeControlBooks.com for Glenn's book, the Working From Home book, and everything else. Go check them out. Until the next time, and as always, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Facebook group or like our Facebook page, and get more out of your Apple tech with MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard and on the web. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us through either our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/MacVoices or by making a one-time donation via the PayPal link on our front page and in the show notes of each episode. You will join these fine people who help bring you Mac Voices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.